The fluorescent lights hummed their usual 60-cycle drone as Natalie Hayes pushed through the Cedar Creek Medical entrance at 10:56 p.m., her scrub still damp from the rain outside. Just another nurse. That was the entire point. She had spent 3 years perfecting invisibility, moving through these Denver corridors like water, present, essential, utterly unremarkable. Her badge clipped to her pocket read N. Hayes, RN, with credentials impeccable and untraceable, everything above board, everything below the surface deliberately erased. The night shift suited her. Fewer people. Fewer questions. Fewer eyes tracking the precise, economical way she moved, the stance she fell into instinctively when crisis alarms sounded, the burned scars across her knuckles that didn't match any civilian nursing accident. She hung her jacket in her locker, the same jacket she'd worn for 3 years, the fabric worn soft at the elbows, the lining still carrying the faint smell of desert sand if you got close enough. Inside that lining, sewn into a hidden seam, sat a faded unit patch from Ramadi. 3rd Battalion call sign. Nightingale 6. She didn't touch it tonight. Some rituals were for nights when she was alone in the break room at 3 a.m., when the exhaustion of pretending finally caught up with her. The 11 p.m. briefing in the nurses' station moved at its usual glacial pace. 12 beds on the night roster, for stable admissions, 1 transfer pending from the ER. The attending was Dr. Marcus Pierce, Chief of Surgery, whose presence seemed to suck oxygen from whatever room he occupied. He stood near the assignment board in his pressed white coat, $3,200 Italian wool, probably, the kind of detail he'd mentioned once during rounds, scanning the room with the expression of a man surveying workers he considered fundamentally inadequate. His watch caught the light. Rolex. Everything about Pierce was expensive armor against something he couldn't name. Natalie took her assignments without comment and moved toward the medication cart. In her peripheral vision, she caught Pierce watching her. Not the friendly observation of a colleague. The narrow-eyed assessment of someone who'd noticed something that bothered him. She'd learned to read that look years ago. It meant he'd seen something that contradicted his expectations. Something that made him uncomfortable. Something he couldn't quite file away into the category where he kept everyone else. The discomfort had started 3 weeks ago when she'd caught a medication error, a dosage that would have caused permanent vision damage to a glaucoma patient, and quietly corrected it without involving Pierce. She'd simply held up the chart, raised one eyebrow, and waited. The order had been changed within seconds. Pierce had looked at her for a long moment after that, something hot moving behind his eyes. Not gratitude. Recognition. The kind of recognition that threatened something in him. Room for 12 needed a laceration repair, a carpenter who'd slipped on a ladder and opened his hand on a sheet of tin. Natalie found him sitting on the gurney with his hand wrapped in a towel, bleeding through the 3rd layer. She didn't rush. She moved like she had all the time in the world, setting up the suture kit with one hand while assessing the wound with the other. The edges were ragged, maybe 2 centimeters, deep enough to need more than skin closure. The antiseptic smell rose sharp and bright as she cleaned the wound. "This is going to sting," she said. 6 words. Efficient. Professional. No unnecessary reassurance. She administered the local anesthetic, waiting exactly 90 seconds for it to take full effect. Then she began. Her hands moved with the precision that came from 300 field surgeries in operating tents under artillery fire, though this carpenter would never know that. Needle in. Through. Across. The movements were automatic, economical, perfect. 4-0 nylon suture. She placed each stitch exactly 2 millimeters apart, closing the wound with the kind of geometric precision that belonged in a textbook, not on the night shift in Denver. The entire repair took 47 seconds. When she was finished, the carpenter stared at the closed wound like she'd performed magic. "That's incredible," he said. "You do that a lot." "It's just stitches," she said. "Keep it dry. See your primary care doctor in 7 days." She was turning to dispose of the used equipment when she noticed Pierce standing in the doorway. How long had he been there? His expression was unreadable, but something had shifted in his face. He'd seen those hands work. He'd seen the precision. He'd seen something that made his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. He turned and left without speaking. That was stage one. The moment he decided she was a threat. The rest of the shift moved in its familiar rhythm: vital signs, medication rounds, one patient asking for extra blankets, another wanting to know if visiting hours had changed. Around 2:15 a.m., the ER called up. New admission. Trauma from a training accident. Blind veteran, Navy SEAL commander, needs intensive monitoring. Room 347. Natalie's hand stilled over the med cart for exactly one breath. She didn't move fast. She didn't move slow. She moved like someone receiving routine patient information, and she walked toward room 347 with the same measured pace she used for every admission. The chart had a photograph. James Garrett. 52 years old. Retired, though his posture in the photo still carried the unbendable straight spine of a man who'd commanded other men through impossible circumstances. She'd seen that posture in Michael's videos home. Michael with his own spine bent at angles that didn't match his genetics, bent by respect for the man who'd come back from every mission with all his people still standing. When she opened the door to room 347, James Garrett was sitting upright on the bed, his new eyes, dark sunglasses indoors, the weight of blindness making his face seem heavier than the photograph suggested, tracking toward the sound of the door. Sinus rhythm on the monitor. Vitals stable. Temperature normal. But his hands were trembling slightly as they rested on his thighs, and that trembling wasn't from medication or pain. It was fear. Raw, undisguised fear of a man who'd spent his entire adult life controlling his environment and had just lost the primary tool that made control possible. "Commander Garrett," she said. Calm. Professional. "I'm Natalie. I'll be taking care of you tonight. Let me get you settled." She worked through the admission with methodical efficiency. Adjusting the bed. Explaining the call button. Checking the foresight, 18 gauge, well placed, good blood return. She didn't mention Michael. She didn't mention Kandahar or the convoy that would have been completely overrun if the commander's extraction team hadn't arrived exactly 43 seconds before impact. She'd read the after-action report. It had been classified, of course, but Michael had told her enough for her to understand what this man had done. "Your son," Garrett said suddenly, his unsighted eyes moving in the direction of her voice. "Michael Hayes. You're his mother." She didn't pause. Didn't hesitate. Just the slightest intake of breath that could have been anything. "Yes," she said. One word. "He's an exceptional Marine." Garrett's voice was different now, not the trembling voice of a frightened man, but something steadier. "Saves people. Follows orders but thinks for himself. That doesn't come from nowhere." Natalie checked his blood oxygen level. 98%. Steady as a metronome. "He's a good man," she said. "I'm proud of him." That was all the conversation he needed. She arranged his pain medication, confirmed his preferences, and settled him as comfortably as possible in a hospital bed that would never feel like his own. As she turned to leave, she felt his eyes track her, still unable to see, but somehow still following her. When her hand touched the doorframe, she paused. Her fingers found the edge of her jacket, brushed against the hidden seam where the unit patch sat like a secret. She didn't let him see that. Over the next 3 days, something shifted. Natalie continued her routine, medications at prescribed intervals, vital sign checks every 4 hours, physical therapy beginning on day 2 as the medical team worked to help Garrett adjust to his new reality. But what others saw as routine nursing, what Dr. Pierce watched with growing hostility from the hallway, was actually something deeper. She knew how a man who'd lost his sight experienced space. She knew how to describe a room in the way that would let him move through it. She knew how to ask the right questions in the right order to rebuild his sense of agency. "What's the light level?" he asked on day 2. "Overcast. Cloud cover about 70%. The sun's behind you." "Northwest," she answered. Not a guess. Measured. Precise. How do you know that? The room has one eastern exposure window. Your skin temperature rose 0.3 degrees when I adjusted the blinds. Cloud cover moves temperature that amount in about 3 minutes at this altitude. She paused. I noticed things. By day 3, when Garrett's daughter visited, she found her father sitting up straighter than he had since the accident, his hand steady when he reached out to find her face. Your mother trained as a combat medic, Natalie heard him say as she passed his room. You can tell by the way she moves. Efficient. Anticipatory. She sees what's coming before it arrives. The daughter looked at her with sudden curiosity, but Natalie had already moved past the doorway, past the recognition, back into the careful architecture of anonymity she'd spent 3 years constructing. Behind her, Dr. Pierce stood at the nurse's station, his hands gripping the edge of the desk so hard his knuckles had gone white. He'd heard the comment too. He watched Natalie move down the corridor with an expression that had hardened into something more dangerous than mere contempt. The question wasn't whether he suspected. The question was how long before he decided to act on it. The question wasn't whether he suspected. The question was how long before he decided to act on it. Dr. Pierce made his move on day 4. Natalie was adjusting Commander Garrett's fur line when she heard his voice in the doorway, that particular tone he used when he wanted an audience. The Venetian blinds cast prison bar shadows across the hospital bed. Commander Garrett's daughter Sarah sat in the corner chair, her phone down, suddenly alert. Nurse Hayes, Pierce said, stepping fully into the room. His white coat seemed too bright against the pale walls. Perhaps you'd like to explain to our patient why you're questioning my medication orders. Do you have a medical degree I'm unaware of? Natalie's hands kept moving. The 4 line was secure. The drip rate was steady. She spoke without turning. Doctor, the dosage you ordered would cause further optic nerve damage. The literature on post-traumatic optic neuropathy. The literature, he interrupted, his voice taking on the cadence of a man who'd practiced this moment, is not your concern. Your concern is following physician orders. Sarah's jaw tightened. She started to stand. Natalie turned slowly. Her eyes met Pierce's for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to confirm what she already knew. He wasn't angry about the medication. He was afraid of her. And fear made men dangerous. Our little Florence Nightingale here thinks 3 years on night shift makes her qualified to practice medicine, Pierce continued, speaking now to Sarah as if Natalie had already left the room. His smile was the smile of a man who'd won something. I apologize for the confusion my staff causes. This won't happen again. The words landed differently than he'd intended. Sarah's hand moved to the bed rail. Commander Garrett's head turned toward Pierce's voice, his blind eye somehow still managing to convey judgment. Natalie absorbed the attack with one measured breath. She felt it first in her chest, the familiar pressure that came before a medevac landed, the moment of compression before action became necessary. She'd felt it in a field hospital in Ramadi with mortar rounds walking toward the building. She'd felt it in interrogation rooms when men tried to establish dominance through volume and title. She did not tremble. She did not retreat. She wiped her eyes once, the motion so economical it barely registered, and when she looked at Pierce again, her voice was calm as a held breath. I know exactly who I am, doctor, she said. The question is whether you do. The silence that followed had texture. It had weight. Commander Garrett's mouth twitched at one corner. Sarah's expression shifted into something that looked like recognition. Pierce's face flushed, that particular crimson that came when a man realized he'd miscalculated. That's insubordination, he said, but his voice had lost its edge. Natalie turned back to the 4. I'm adjusting the flow rate to 50 milliliters per hour, as indicated by the patient's current ocular pressure readings. Your previous order specified 120. That was negligent. This is correct. She didn't wait for his response. She documented the change, signed the electronic record with the steady hand of someone who'd signed consent forms under gunfire, and continued her assessment as if he'd already left. But he didn't leave immediately. He stood in the doorway for 7 seconds. She counted them the way she counted respirations, the way she counted the seconds between thinking and acting. Then his footsteps retreated down the hallway, moving faster than they'd arrived. Sarah exhaled slowly. "Thank you," she whispered. Natalie finished the vitals without answering. Some words were too heavy for gratitude. 2 days later, Natalie entered the staff break room at 3:17 a.m. carrying her dinner in a cloth bag, leftovers from the Thai place 3 blocks from her apartment. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their familiar mechanical prayer. 4 nurses sat at the grey laminate table, Jennifer from pediatrics, Marcus from cardiac, 2 traveling nurses she didn't know well. The moment Natalie's shoes crossed the threshold, something shifted. It wasn't loud. It was quieter than loud. It was the sound of chairs scraping linoleum, careful and deliberate. One nurse gathered her coffee. Another folded her newspaper. They didn't make eye contact. They moved with the synchronized precision of a choreographed exit, leaving in single file like a parade moving away. Jennifer was the last one through the door. She leaned toward Marcus just loudly enough for the words to carry. "I heard she bought her nursing license online." Some kind of fraud situation. The door swung shut. Its hinges creaked like a small animal dying. Natalie sat at the empty table. She set down her dinner bag. She didn't open it. The overhead lights buzzed their electric mantras. The refrigerator hummed in the corner. Outside, Denver's pre-dawn air pressed against the windows with the weight of something held just before release. She sat alone for 8 minutes. Then she stood, left the bag untouched, and returned to the unit. The break room rumors spread like a bloodborne infection. By the next afternoon, they'd mutated into specifics. A fake credential. An invalid license. Questions about her background. The kind of details that felt precise enough to be true, which was exactly how rumors worked. They lived in the gap between fact and plausibility, and in that gap, they multiplied. On day 6 of Commander Garrett's admission, Dr. Pierce arrived at the unit during shift change with a document in his hand. He walked directly to the bulletin board outside the ICU, the one where staff notices were posted, the one where every nurse passed multiple times per shift. He used a pushpin. The motion was deliberate. Natalie saw it from the medication station. The white paper, the typed text, the red lettering at the top that read disciplinary notice. She didn't move toward it immediately. She finished entering before documentation for her current patient. She washed her hands. She completed the hand hygiene protocol with the same careful attention she brought to everything: soap, water, the friction that killed bacteria, the rinsing that left nothing behind. Only then did she walk to the board. The notice read, "Disciplinary write-up, Nurse N. Hayes, insubordination. Questioning physician orders. Suspicious credentials under review. This constitutes a formal employment warning." It was posted during the shift change intentionally. Intentionally so maximum staff would see it. Intentionally so it would be the first thing mentioned in report rooms. Intentionally so the narrative would begin: Natalie Hayes was trouble. Natalie Hayes was a liar. Natalie Hayes was the kind of person you didn't sit with at lunch. Her coffee cup trembled slightly as she reached for the notice. The tremor wasn't fear. It was restraint, the careful calibration of muscles that could have torn the paper to shreds, that could have thrown the cup through the window, that could have done a lot of things. The tremor was the difference between action and discipline won by a fraction of a millimeter. A medical student snickered behind her. Young, maybe 24, the kind of confidence that came from never having lost anything. He was speaking to an intern. "Did you see that? Pretty crazy for someone just 3 years in." Natalie turned. Her eyes found his. Not angry. Not even disappointed. Just present. Just a long, flat stare from someone who'd seen what happened to people who laughed at the wrong time in the wrong places. The student's snicker died. His face went pale. He looked away. She turned back to the notice, removed it from the board. The pushpin came free with a small metal sound, and continued to Commander Garrett's room where his medication was due at 0330 hours. Her hands didn't shake anymore. But that night, after her shift, she sat in her car in the parking lot with the faded unit patch in her lap. It was the size of her thumb, sewn into the jacket lining she'd worn through military medicine courses, through 3 rotations in forward surgical teams, through the day in Ramadi when the mortar round had taken the hearing in her right ear and left her left hand with scars that still caught the light a certain way. The patch was so faded the unit number was nearly invisible. Almost like it had never existed at all. She held it for 3 minutes. Then she folded the jacket carefully and set it aside. Over the next 48 hours, Dr. Pierce moved his operation from public mockery to something colder and more systematic. He called the hospital board's chief of surgery, not a text, an actual phone call that he placed from his office with the door closed, his voice modulated just above a whisper. "I have concerns about a staff member's credentials. Background irregularities. We may have a liability issue." He didn't name Natalie. Not yet. He was planting seeds, the way certain people did. He was establishing the narrative framework. By the time he named her, everyone would already be thinking of her as a problem. The next thing he did was alter the schedule. He reassigned Jennifer and Marcus, the 2 ICU nurses who'd worked most closely with Natalie over the past month, the ones who'd seen her competence firsthand. He split them to opposite shifts, Jennifer to days, Marcus to swing, so Natalie would work only with the newer staff, the ones who still relied on protocol and caution, the ones who hadn't yet learned to trust her. Then he restricted her access to the electronic medical record system. Security protocol update, he told the IT department. Her login still worked, but her documentation permissions were throttled. She could view records but not edit them fully, could note concerns but only through a limited text field that flagged for supervisor review. It was a technical way of silencing her, a bureaucratic way of saying your observations don't count, your documentation is suspect, your presence here requires verification. The final piece was the phone call he placed to the state nursing board on a Thursday afternoon. A routine credential verification request. Very standard. Very normal. Just checking the details on one Natalie Hayes, currently employed at Cedar Creek Medical in Denver. Her file was sealed from the military discharge, which meant the state would find incomplete records. Incomplete records looked like fraud. Fraud looked like guilt. Pierce knew this. He was counting on this. He was counting on the gap between who she had been and who she was now to become, a chasm that swallowed her credibility. What he didn't know was that those sealed records had signatures on them. Federal signatures. The kind that didn't get unredacted because a suspicious hospital administrator placed a phone call. But he would find out. Not yet. Not for several more days. For now, Natalie was simply a nurse with a disciplinary write-up, isolated staff, throttled system access, and a background that was beginning to look very much like a lie. She adjusted her patients' medications anyway. She caught a medication error in the cardiac unit that would have killed a 68-year-old man with atrial fibrillation, the kind of error that happened when people didn't double-check, didn't question, didn't think. She corrected it and said nothing to anyone. In Commander Garrett's room on day 8, the blind veteran reached for her hand while she was checking his pupil response. His scarred palm met hers, both of them hands that had held weight in places where weight was life and death. "You remind me of someone," he said. "Medic we had in Ramadi. Not many people move the way you do. Like they've already decided what matters and what doesn't." Natalie squeezed his hand once. "Get some rest, Commander." "It's James," he said. "And I know who you are. I've known since day 3. She didn't answer. She left the room with her pulse steady and her face neutral and her mind already 6 steps ahead, calculating the geometry of what was coming and whether the answers she'd buried 18 years ago would stay buried long enough. The trauma alert sounded at 4:41 a.m. Not the routine alert that came 3 times a week. The full catastrophe code that made every nurse in Cedar Creek Medical move like their own lives depended on it. Natalie was restocking the suture cart in the supply room when the overhead speaker crackled and released the words that changed everything: mass casualty event. Incoming 12. Construction accident on Spee Boulevard. Multiple penetrating trauma. ETA for minutes. She set down the 4.0 absorbable sutures with the same deliberate care she would have used in Ramadi. The movements were identical. The breath was identical. The way her mind compartmentalized everything that was about to happen, identical. 12 workers. Construction accident. Spee Boulevard was 8 minutes from Cedar Creek even with traffic lights ignored. Which meant these patients were coming from a site close enough that the ambulances had made good time. Which meant some of them were still conscious. Which meant some of them would not be. The ER doors burst open at 4:51 a.m. and the controlled chaos of a normal night shift evaporated like water on hot asphalt. The first stretcher came through with a man whose left leg was barely attached, hanging by tissue and tendons, blood pooling beneath him in a trail that smelled of copper and diesel fuel. The second stretcher carried a woman with a compound fracture of the femur, bone spikes tenting through skin. The third and fourth came faster, a blur of grimacing faces and 4 lines that hadn't been established yet and paramedics shouting vitals that made the charge nurse's face go pale. Trauma bays 1 through 4, the charge nurse called out, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly as she pointed. Natalie, get to bay 3. We're setting up 5 and 6 in the hallway. Dr. Pierce emerged from his office like a shark detecting blood in the water from 3 miles away. He was still in yesterday's dress shirt, sleeves rolled, tie loosened, the look of someone who slept at his desk because the alternative was admitting he had nothing better to do with his nights. His eye scanned the incoming patients with the predatory focus of a man who lived for moments when he could prove his superiority. This was his domain. This was where competence showed itself. It took him 90 seconds to prove otherwise. Get me 2 units on the impalement case, Pierce called out as he approached Bay 3, where paramedics were transferring a young man, couldn't have been more than 28, onto the trauma table. The rebar had gone through his chest at an angle, just below the left nipple, and the angle was wrong. All wrong. Entry trajectory suggested the spear had clipped the inferior vena cava. This patient had maybe minutes before his blood pressure dropped below viable recovery. No, wait. For units. Actually, we need to prioritize the chest trauma first. Get the trauma surgeons down here now. The nurses exchanged glances. It wasn't a request filtered through proper channels. It was a man giving orders faster than they could process them, each instruction contradicting the last, each one delivered with increasing volume as if volume could substitute for clarity. Pierce stood in the center of the bay like he was conducting an orchestra, except the musicians had no idea what song was being played. Bay 3 needs 2 units, Pierce snapped at a younger nurse who had frozen, unsure whether to follow the original instruction or the revision. Get moving. And somebody tell me why trauma surgery isn't here yet. It's been 40 seconds. Natalie moved through the chaos like water finding its level. Not rushing. Not frozen. Moving with the kind of efficiency that came from operating rooms where the electricity could fail at any second and shrapnel could punch through canvas tents and the only thing standing between a patient and death was the person holding the clamp. She was in Bay 2, stabilizing a woman with massive leg trauma when she heard the flatline beep from Bay 3. The monitor was screaming. The patient's heart had stopped. Pierce's voice changed pitch. Not lower. Higher. The sound of someone whose authority had just been challenged by biology. Get the crash cart. Start compressions. Get me. He stopped talking because the patient's pupils had already fixed. Dilated. Dead. The rebar had nicked something catastrophic and the human body had simply decided it was done. Natalie could see it from across the ER. Could see the exact moment when Dr. Pierce realized his contradictory orders, his delays, his paralysis had just cost a patient his life. Could see him search his mind for someone to blame. She could see the moment his eyes found her. Natalie was already moving toward Bay 3 before conscious thought could intervene. Her hands knew what needed to happen. Her mind had already catalogued the depth of the penetrating trauma, the location of the rebar, the angle of entry, the structures that needed to be accessed to save what could still be saved. In Ramadi, she had done thoracotomies in tents with diesel generators powering the lights and wounded Marines lined up outside because there was no time for triage protocols. She had cracked ribs and clamped bleeders and talked patients through their own deaths when there was no other option. Her hands had held the lives of 57 different people. The muscle memory didn't fade. It lived in the tendons. "Do not touch my patient, Hayes. That is an order." Pierce's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. He was between her and the table, his body rigid, his face a landscape of rage and panic and desperation. "You will step back. Now." Natalie's eyes met his for exactly 1 second. She didn't argue. Didn't explain. Didn't ask permission. She said, 90 seconds. That's what he has. I don't care if he has 90 minutes. You will not. She reached past him. Not aggressively. Deliberately. The way someone moves when they have already made peace with the consequences. The surgical kit was on the instrument tray. The combat knife was in the emergency supplies. She had requisitioned it from the OR supply 3 months ago when no one was paying attention, because some things from Ramadi couldn't be left behind. The knife was sharp enough to cut through bone. The weight of it in her hand felt like coming home. Pierce grabbed her wrist. "I will have your license. I will destroy your career. I swear to God, Hayes." She met his eyes with perfect calm. Her voice dropped an octave. "Then take it." She didn't wrench her arm free. She simply stood there, perfectly still, eyes locked on his, until he realized that restraining her was restraining a drowning man from swimming. He released her. The field thoracotomy took 83 seconds. She cracked the ribs with a sound like branches snapping, the knife going through the intercostal muscle with the precision of someone who had done this before when the alternative was a flag being sent home to someone's family. The inferior vena cava was exactly where she expected. Exactly where it shouldn't have been. The rebar had punctured it in 3 places. Blood had been pouring into the pericardium. She clamped with a technique she hadn't used in 15 years and the muscle memory was perfect. The bleeding stopped. She was reaching for the cardiac massage position when his heart caught a rhythm on its own. 1 beat. 2 beats. 3. The monitor moved from flatline to sinus rhythm like a switch being flipped. The patient's oxygen saturation climbed, 42%, 61%, 78%. His pupils still slightly reactive. His blood pressure rising from the clamp, from the fluid that was already running wide open through the 4 lines. He was alive. He was actually alive. The ER staff stared at her like she had just performed magic instead of trauma surgery. The younger nurses whose faces had been frightened 30 seconds ago now looked the way pilots look when someone walks away from a crashed helicopter, like they had witnessed someone cross a boundary that was supposed to be impassable. Dr. Pierce's face went through 5 emotions in sequence: shock, rage, shame, calculation, and finally something that looked like cold fury. He didn't congratulate her. He didn't acknowledge what had just happened. He simply turned and walked directly out of Bay 3, his footsteps fast but controlled, the way someone moves when they are deciding how to destroy a person. The phone in his office began ringing before the patient's blood had been wiped off the instrument tray. Within 90 minutes of the patient's heart resuming its steady rhythm, Dr. Pierce had already made the first call. His office door was closed. His voice was measured, almost regretful, the way a surgeon's voice sounds when delivering a terminal diagnosis. He sat at his desk with the hospital directory open, his finger moving down the board members' names like a predator selecting prey. The phone pressed against his ear. "Yes, hello, it's Dr. Richard Pierce from Cedar Creek Medical. I'm calling regarding a serious incident this morning involving scope of practice violations." He paused, letting the gravity settle. A nursing staff member performed a surgical procedure without supervision or appropriate licensure. I stopped it as quickly as I became aware, but the patient was already compromised. The lie sat perfectly in the silence. I wanted you to hear this from me first, in case there are legal ramifications. He hung up and dialed the next number. Then the next. 8 board members. 8 calls. 8 narratives planted, each one slightly different, each one shaped to weaponize different fears: litigation, liability, reputation damage, regulatory violation. By 11:44 a.m., every decision-maker at Cedar Creek Medical had heard that a nurse had committed a dangerous overreach. The second move was surgical in its precision. Dr. Pierce had access to the staff schedule. By noon, he had reassigned every ER nurse who had witnessed the thoracotomy. The 3 nurses who'd handed Natalie instruments, who'd watched her hands move with absolute confidence, who'd seen the patient's oxygen saturation climb from 68 to 89 to stable, they were scattered across different departments effective immediately. One was moved to the ICU on night shift. Another to pediatrics on days. The third to the medical surgical ward on an evening rotation. No coordination was possible. No conversation could be had. The story they might have told, the story of a nurse performing an emergency procedure with the precision of someone who had done it before, many times, in places where surgeons weren't available and the patient died if you hesitated, that story was now impossible to deliver as a unified testimony. Dr. Pierce had learned long ago that isolated witnesses couldn't corroborate. Isolated witnesses looked like they had something to hide. The third move was administrative. By 1 o'clock, IT had received a directive to archive Natalie's digital charting notes due to system maintenance protocol. The paper charts from the trauma bay were pulled and flagged as under administrative review. Access denied. The medical records that would have documented exactly what she'd done, in exactly what sequence, with exactly what clinical justification, those records were now locked behind bureaucratic glass. He'd poisoned not just her reputation but the evidence itself. The truth could exist only in the memories of people he'd systematically separated. Pain was information. And he was withholding all of it. At 1:43 p.m., Natalie was called to the administrative conference room on the 3rd floor. She didn't know what she was walking into. The call had been casual: "Nurse Hayes, would like to review your shift. Can you come to admin?" She walked up the stairwell, her scrubs still carrying the faint copper smell of the trauma bay, and pushed through the door into a room with Hospital Administrator Thomas Chen and HR Director Karen Walsh seated on one side of a long table. Dr. Pierce was already there, files spread before him like evidence at a trial. He gestured to the empty chair across from them. "She's Saturday." The fluorescent light overhead buzzed, a sound like insects trapped in glass. No one spoke for 3 seconds. Then Dr. Pierce slid a folder across the table with 2 fingers, the way you'd push a dismissal notice. His voice was soft, almost sympathetic. "Nurse Hayes, you performed a surgical procedure without a license this morning. You operated on a patient in direct violation of your scope of practice and my explicit orders as chief of surgery." She didn't respond. She'd learned long ago that silence was stronger than denial. He continued, his voice never changing pitch, "We cannot employ someone who misrepresents their qualifications and disregards clear medical authority. Effective immediately, you're terminated for practicing medicine without a license and credential fraud." Thomas Chen slid a termination form across the table. The words blurred slightly. Karen Walsh maintained perfect professional distance, as if this were routine, as if they weren't erasing her. Natalie's jaw tightened, the only visible response she allowed herself. She had survived worse than this. She had stitched up wounds in operating tents under mortar fire. She had held organs that shouldn't have been accessible through the ribcage. She had told families that their sons weren't coming home. She could survive humiliation from a surgeon so consumed by his own inadequacy that he needed to destroy someone just to feel alive. She picked up the pen. One measured breath. Her signature was steady. Dr. Pierce watched her sign, and something flickered across his face, disappointment, perhaps, that she wasn't breaking. That she wasn't giving him the satisfaction of witnessing her collapse. She slid the papers back. "I saved his life," she said quietly. The statement hung there like a scalpel. Dr. Pierce's eyes went cold. Your background has irregularities. Gaps we can't explain. We believe you may have misrepresented your qualifications entirely. He'd already made those calls. He'd already poisoned every reference. By the time she tried to verify her credentials, every professional contact would have heard whispers of fraud. The system was already corrupted in his favor. Natalie stood without another word and walked out. 3 days later, she stood in the basement laundry room of Cedar Creek Medical, folding scrubs that no longer belonged to her. The fabric was still warm from the industrial dryer, smelling of industrial bleach and antiseptic, that particular hospital smell that sinks into your pores and becomes part of who you are. She folded each set with precise hospital corners, a habit from different uniforms in different wars, in rooms where precision had meant the difference between someone's child coming home and a flag-draped coffin. The laundry attendant, a woman in her 60s named Rosa, didn't look up. Rosa had learned long ago not to get involved in hospital politics. Natalie placed each folded set on the steel counter in the designated bin for returned equipment. This was the final indignity, returning her uniforms like costumes after opening night. She was reaching for the last set when her fingers found it, the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining. She pulled the jacket closer and traced the stitching with her thumb. 1st Medical Battalion. Ramadi. 2006, the thread was coming loose, the patch fading like a ghost. She'd sewn it there 7 years ago, the only physical evidence of who she'd been before she'd been ordered to disappear, before her military records had been sealed and her file marked Classified Operation Burial, before Captain Natalie Hayes had been erased and replaced with a night shift nurse who kept her head down. She wondered if erasing herself had been worth the cost. If all the silence, all the restraint, all the years of watching people like Dr. Pierce accumulate power they didn't deserve, if any of that had purchased her anything except this moment, standing alone in a hospital basement, holding a jacket with a ghost sewn into its lining. Rosa cleared her throat. The moment passed. Natalie kept the jacket and walked toward the exit, her footsteps echoing on the tile floor like a countdown. She was halfway across the parking lot, rain beginning to fall, when her phone buzzed. The message was from the hospital operator. Commander Garrett is asking for you. Says it's important. She shouldn't go back. She was terminated. Escorted off premises meant terminated. But something pulled her like a current. She turned around and slipped through the south entrance, moving like someone who still belonged there, carrying that authority in her shoulders even though she'd just been dismantled. The hallway outside Commander Garrett's room was unusually crowded. Staff stood in clusters, their voices hushed. She heard accented English first, a voice thick with tears, speaking in rapid Arabic-inflected English, Nightingale 6. Is that truly you? An Iraqi man in his mid-40s stood near the doorway, a patient wristband visible on his wrist, his eyes locked on her face like he was looking at someone who had risen from the dead. You saved my village. The field hospital. You commanded the medical station when the mortars were falling. You are the angel of Ramadi. The words hung in the air like a grenade with the pin already pulled. The hallway froze. Every head turned toward her. A Marine colonel in dress blues, standing near Commander Garrett's doorway, narrowed his eyes on her face. He pulled out his phone, made a single call, and suddenly he was reading from a classified database, his voice carrying the weight of authority, Captain Natalie Hayes. The name hit like electricity. Nurses whispered. The Iraqi man was kneeling now, tears streaming. Commander Garrett's daughter Sarah stepped into the hallway from the room, confused, asking what was happening. A medical resident dropped his clipboard. Someone said captain, like the word didn't fit. Natalie backed against the wall, shaking her head slightly. No, please, not like this. Not here. Not with an audience. The colonel continued without hesitation, his voice reading, 1st Medical Battalion, Ramadi, 2006 through 2007. More staff gathered in the hallway. Someone's phone was already filming. Security guards approached but stopped, unsure what protocol applied to whatever was happening. The hospital administrator appeared from an office, confused. Staff were already Googling 1st Medical Battalion Ramadi. The translator was telling anyone who would listen about the field hospital operating under mortar fire, about the woman who had worked for 36 hours straight, who had saved people who should have been marked expectant. A nurse asked quietly, "Why didn't she tell us?" Another answered, "Pierce fired her this morning." The name Pierce rippled through the hallway like poison spreading through water. The colonel read on, a Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat operations, Silver Star for valor under fire, where she performed 47 surgical interventions under enemy fire. The number hung there, 47. 47 lives. The hallway seemed to shrink around that single number. Dr. Pierce burst through the crowd after the word 47, his voice loud and cracking, "This circus ends now. Clear this hallway immediately." But no one moved. The rotor wash sound grew louder outside, a helicopter landing on the hospital roof. Boots on tile. A 2-star general in full dress uniform rounded the corner, walking directly toward her with the kind of purposeful stride that made the air pressure change. He rendered a full salute, his arm moving with military precision, his eyes meeting hers with absolute recognition. She didn't return it, she was frozen, every nerve screaming that this was real, that she was no longer invisible. The general's voice carried, "Captain Hayes. It is an honor." Dr. Pierce tried to interrupt, "General, I don't know what narrative you've been provided, but this woman," the general didn't even glance at him. Commander Garrett emerged from his room, guided by his daughter, his blind eyes searching the hallway. "Natalie? Is that you?" "Jesus Christ, I knew it. I knew there was something. My God." A Pentagon liaison stepped forward with a tablet, reading, Codename Nightingale 6. Mission Classification Level Top Secret Sensitive Compartmented Information. Operational Status, Order to Disappear After Classified Operation Burial, 2007. The translator sobbed openly. Sarah asked, "You knew my father?" Natalie's voice cracked for the first time, "I knew your father saved my son." The Pentagon liaison's voice went cold, turning directly to Dr. Pierce. "Dr. Pierce, can you explain why you attempted to access and forge Captain Hayes' sealed military records at 11:56 p.m. last evening?" The hallway went dead silent. Pierce's face drained to white. 2 federal agents stepped forward from the crowd. They'd been waiting for this moment. They were already holding handcuffs. The hallway on Cedar Creek's 3rd floor smelled like antiseptic and hope. Natalie was returning a discharge folder when she heard it, a voice thin as paper, cracking with 18 years of buried memory, Nightingale 6. She turned. The refugee patient from bed 312, the one admitted 4 days ago with pneumonia so severe his oxygen sat at 71%, sat in a wheelchair pushed by an aide. His name was Kareem Haddad. His ribs showed through his hospital gown like a xylophone played by disease. And his eyes, dark, wet, fixed entirely on her, held the kind of recognition that erases time. "I know you," he whispered. "I know you from the dust. From the screaming. You came to Ramadi when the helicopters stopped coming." Natalie's jaw tightened. Just a fraction. Her hand steadied against the folder. "I think you have me confused with someone else, Mr. Haddad." "No." Tears moved down his face like they had somewhere to be. "You were there. May 2008. The field hospital inside Al-Farak Mosque. You commanded it with 60 medics and a blood supply running on ice and prayer. My sister was shot in the abdomen. You held her open with your hands, Captain, and you saved her. You saved all of us. 63 patients. Every single one walked out." He gripped the wheelchair's arms. "I came to America to tell that story. I became a citizen so I could say it out loud. And here you are. Pushing papers. Hiding." The folder felt heavier. Everything felt heavier. 3 nurses stood 30 feet away at the medication cart, but Natalie's world had compressed to this moment, this breath, this man who remembered her when she'd spent 16 years trying to be forgotten. "Your sister," Natalie said. 10 words maximum. She kept it that way. What's her name now? Farah Mansu. She has 3 children. In Boston. She told them about Nightingale's 6th every birthday. Kareem's voice cracked. Thank you. Thank you for being alive. That was when Colonel Marcus Halloway, visiting Marine, retired, 22 years combat command, the kind of man whose presence made the air pressure change, stepped out of the medication room with a patient file in one hand and his phone in the other. He'd been reviewing Natalie's medical notation on another patient case. He'd heard every word. He didn't move for 3 seconds. Then he did something that would remake the entire architecture of Cedar Creek Medical in the next 90 minutes. He pulled out his phone, accessed the Pentagon's classified personnel database using credentials that still worked from his SOCOM liaison days, and began reading. Captain Natalie Hayes, Halloway said, his voice the color of brass. For extraordinary heroism in combat operations, where she performed 47 surgical interventions under enemy fire, maintaining surgical efficacy in a structure with active sniper positions on 3 sides. For leadership under conditions that violated every medical safety protocol and saved every single life under her command. He kept reading. More names appeared. More dates. More impossible numbers. The medication cart nurses stopped moving. A resident froze mid-stride. The hallway went dead silent except for Halloway's voice, steady, relentless, pulling classified truth into fluorescent light. That was when Dr. Pierce burst through the emergency stairwell door at a run. He moved like a man who'd received a phone call. Probably from his administrative assistant who'd flagged the classified database access on Cedar Creek's network. Probably realized in real time what was happening. This is a hospital, not a sideshow, Pierce said, his voice loud enough to crack against the walls. This circus ends now. That woman is not a military anything. She's a nurse with a fabricated story and you're all falling for it because you're idiots who watch too many movies. He looked directly at Natalie with the eyes of a man who'd spent 2 weeks dismantling her systematically and fully expected her to crumble. She didn't crumble. She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. That was when the general walked out of Commander Garrett's room. 2-star. Full dress uniform. The kind of presence that made Pierce look like someone's angry assistant. General Michael Carver had come to conduct Garrett's discharge personally, old SEAL teammate, retirement ceremony in progress, protocol that usually involved paperwork and handshakes. He'd heard the hallway commotion from Garrett's room and appeared with his aide, military bearing like a blade. Carver's eyes found Natalie first. Then found the Navy Cross and Silver Star visible on Halloway's phone screen, the medal citations pulled directly from declassified records. He saluted her. Not casually. Not perfunctorily. The kind of salute that acknowledges something that cannot be questioned: rank, service, sacrifice, honor. His hand moved to his temple with the precision of a man who'd rendered that salute 1,000 times across 38 years of Marine command. Pierce watched this happen. Watched a 2-star general salute a nurse in scrubs. Watched the calculus of his universe reorganize in real time. What is this? Pierce demanded. What is happening right now? That was when the Pentagon liaison stepped out of the stairwell, the same stairwell Pierce had just used. A woman in a grey suit with FBI credentials on her belt and the kind of calm that comes from having already won every argument before it started. Dr. Sterling Pierce, she said, reading from her phone like she was describing someone else's autopsy. Last night, 11:24 p.m., you accessed Cedar Creek Secure Network and attempted to breach Captain Natalie Hayes' sealed military records. The database flagged the access immediately. At 11:52 p.m., you sent 2 falsified emails to the Colorado Board of Nursing, claiming credential irregularities requiring investigation. At 11:58 p.m., you accessed the hospital's incident reporting system and altered the timestamp on the emergency thoracotomy documentation, changing the procedural start time to make it appear you initiated the response. She looked up from her phone. The FBI has been monitoring your access attempt since yesterday morning. All of this is federal criminal tampering with classified documents. You're under arrest. Two federal agents moved forward from where they'd been standing in plain sight the entire time, waiting. Watching. Ready. The cuffs came out. The rights were read. Pierce tried to maintain authority like a man trying to hold back the tide with his hands. "I'm chief of surgery. I was protecting this hospital from a fraud. This woman," the liaison interrupted, "is Captain Natalie Hayes, U.S. Navy Medical Corps, retired. Her declassification was approved 17 minutes ago. Your continued defamation of her is now a matter of federal record, and every word you're saying is being recorded." The cuffs locked with a sound like punctuation. Pierce's medical license suspension came through on the liaison's phone while she was still reading him his rights. Two of the board members had already voted. The third joined while they were walking him toward the stairwell. Unanimous. Immediate. Pending trial. His plea agreement, already prepared, waiting for this moment, included 2 years driving a medical supply van for the VA hospital in Denver. The same VA hospital where Dr. Hendricks worked. And Dr. Amora. And every other physician Pierce had weaponized against Natalie. They would see him every single day, pushing supplies, watching his fall, measuring the distance between what he'd been and what he'd become. The perp walk began in the stairwell. But Pierce knew, everyone knew, that his actual defeat was happening here, now, in this hallway, filmed on 17 phones, witnessed by staff he'd spent months isolating Natalie from. The nurse who'd told staff to avoid the break room when Natalie sat down was watching. The resident who'd accepted Pierce's whispered warnings about her credentials was watching. The administrator who'd received Pierce's private phone calls about her background was watching. They were all watching a man in handcuffs who'd tried to destroy someone he didn't understand, and lost. The FBI vehicle waited in the ambulance bay. Kareem watched from his wheelchair, tears moving differently now, not gratitude but something harder to name. Vindication. Witness. The knowledge that what he'd carried in silence for 18 years was finally speaking itself aloud. Commander Garrett emerged from his room, his blind eyes tracking Pierce's movement by sound alone, the scuff of shoes on tile, the creak of the federal agent's belt, the finality of a car door closing. Garrett's daughter Sarah stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, watching a man who'd nearly destroyed the nurse who'd saved her father's life twice, once in Kandahar, once by staying invisible and competent and kind. Natalie stood alone in the hallway, the folder still in her hands, the unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining no longer a secret. General Carver approached her slowly, like approaching something sacred, and spoke only 4 words. "Welcome home, Captain Hayes." 2 weeks later, the light through the hospital windows fell differently. That's what Natalie noticed first, not the reinstatement, not the back pay, not the formal apology printed on hospital letterhead, but that the light had somehow shifted. Or maybe she had. She stood in Commander Garrett's discharge suite, not terminal ward, not crisis management, but actual recovery. His blind eyes followed her voice across the room with the precision of a man who'd learned to navigate by sound the way other men navigated by sight. His daughter Sarah sat in the corner reviewing her medical school orientation materials. She'd gotten in early acceptance, full scholarship, with an essay about a nurse who saved her father twice. "I always wondered where Michael learned that kind of courage," Garrett said, reaching toward her voice. His hands found her face gently, the way blind men know another person's identity, through touch, through time, through something deeper than vision. "Now I know. He got it from you." Natalie didn't flinch. Didn't pull away. Let him hold the answer to a question he'd carried for a decade. "He got it from you. You taught him." "No." Garrett's hands moved to her shoulders. "He taught me. Just took me 16 years to understand what I was looking at." Through the window, Dr. Pierce loaded medical supply boxes into a VA hospital van in the parking lot below. The van was already dented, already weathered by his route through every building where people he'd once commanded worked. His plea agreement had 2 years left. Every morning, driving supplies. Every afternoon, watching staff recognize him. Every evening, the knowledge that he'd tried to destroy a woman who'd held her country together with surgical wire and will in Ramadi, and she'd simply kept working when he failed her. Pierce looked up. Saw Natalie watching him from the third-floor window. Looked away. The Iraqi translator, Karim, discharged but visiting daily, brought her tea every shift. A small ritual. A thank you that didn't need words. His sister Farah had called from Boston, asked if Natalie ever traveled, if they could bring their children to thank her properly. Natalie had said yes. That was new. Saying yes. Building something instead of erasing it. The hospital had hung her Navy Cross and Silver Star in the main lobby with a plaque, Captain Natalie Hayes, RN, our hero was always here. She'd asked them 3 times to take it down. They'd refused. The plaque stayed. The medal stayed. The truth stayed. At 3 a.m., alone in the break room, Natalie ate her sandwich the way she always did. Methodical. Quiet. Present. One by one, for nurses entered without being invited. A resident. 2 techs. They didn't apologize, words wouldn't be enough, and they understood that. They simply Saturday. At different tables, at different angles, but present. In solidarity with someone they dismissed without knowing. Someone who'd simply kept showing up, shift after shift, while a man tried to erase her. Natalie nodded. They nodded back. The unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining was now framed on her locker, visible to everyone who passed. She still worked nights. Still kept her eyes down during rounds. But now when she walked past staff, they stood straighter. And that was something. She was home. Not because the Pentagon declassified her. Not because a general saluted her. But because she'd finally stopped running long enough to let someone see her. And they had. And they'd stayed. If you know someone like Natalie, someone quiet, someone competent, someone hiding something true, tell them their story matters. Share this video with anyone who needs to know, the loudest person in the room is rarely the one holding it all together. Subscribe for more stories of hidden heroes. Leave a comment, tell us about a nurse or caregiver who changed your life without ever asking for recognition. And if you or someone you know has military service you're proud of, don't hide it. The world needs to see you.